Well, and so to set the stage for our panel conversation, I want to have a brief conversation with Randy. And of course, you need no introduction to this group, but as stated, chairman of the Institute for Indo-Pacific Studies, former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs, Vice Chairman of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, formerly working also at the State Department and at the Pentagon. And so you have a long history of looking at the NDS and being involved with preparation of NDSs. And so the first question I think that I want to ask, really just to set the stage and context for this, is how you see the NDS and the NSS as having evolved over the time of your career in and out of government. And what is the significance of the NDS in particular in terms of setting priorities within the building alongside the challenges of using it as a tool for political communication?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Well, you know, the evolution from the time that I've been involved, either, you know, as an implementer or in some instances in policy positions where I've had some input, you know, the world has changed a lot. So, you know, I was commissioned in the Navy in 1989, a few months before the Berlin Wall fell, and they sent me to intelligence training school, and we studied all Soviet platforms and all Russian stuff. And so, you know, in many ways, for the last 30 years, we've been trying to redefine or re-articulate our interests, because some are enduring. Homeland security is always number one in every national security strategy, national defense strategy I've ever read. But you know, this sort of goes through the unipolar moment to the global war on terror to the reemergence of great power competition, and it's in some ways reactive to world events, in some ways trying to define, you know, what our priorities are based on the evolution of not only events but countries that are either in the partner or allied camp or the competitor camp. And I think, you know, it's been a real mixed bag in terms of how impactful these documents are, and I would really draw your attention to the 2000 National Defense Strategy as being a very important document for the Pentagon and the defense enterprise. And the reasons, I mean, it's, you know, you could say because it's well written and clear and all that, and I think that's part of it. You know, the NDS in 2018 named a priority theater, a pacing challenge, and that's extremely helpful when you have a very large enterprise, 3 million or so people if you count uniformed military, diverse enterprise when you look at the various activities of defense agencies, and getting everybody to row in the same direction. Clarity helps. But it's also the fact that the Secretary of Defense signed it, owned it, and was really the primary agent in the defense enterprise driving implementation. There's no substitute for that. And you know, even in that case where I think there was great clarity, great specificity in terms of goals, you know, even then implementation can be a bit uneven, particularly on the resourcing side, because there's other actors, there's the Congress, there's other events that come up. So, you know, in our case, Pacific Priority, China pacing challenge, but there was Afghanistan winding down, and so, you know, global events can impact things. So I would say, you know, as a general matter, they can be impactful if leadership really embraces this and says this is a priority to implement it faithfully. But even then, it's, you know, kind of gets thrown in the mix of other world events, and right now, you know, with the attack on Iran, and the commitment that is still a little bit unclear in terms of, you know, timelines and how much attention and resources that's going to require, and the fact that it gets thrown in the mix with other players too. You know, if it's true that Western Hemisphere has sort of been prioritized at a higher level, and I would say that you got to unpack that a little more, because I think in this administration, Homeland Defense and Western Hemisphere are sort of melded together. In other words, Western Hemisphere is really an extension of Homeland Defense in their minds when they think about border security, immigration, counter-narcotics. That's still kind of the broader Homeland Defense. And in fact, the NDS, it's one pillar, Homeland Defense in Western Hemisphere. But, you know, even if that's the case, you've got a Congress, you've got the National Defense Authorization Act still resourcing the defense enterprise as if deterrence of China and the Indo-Pacific is the priority. So, you know, it's important, and it's read carefully within the enterprise, but also to the international community. So I know in many instances our friends and partners and allies read it more closely than maybe some in our own system. But you know, you really have to sort of put it into context with the greater whole, which includes speeches, other activities, other bilateral engagements and multilateral engagements where statements are put out, what Congress is doing, what world events are unfolding. And so I do think it's important, but important put in the right context.
Okay. Well, so you mentioned the 2000 National Defense Strategy as a notable document that was very important in pushing things forward at the Pentagon. But then there was 2001, 9/11. And we've already mentioned Iran again, and your career has been focused on China security. How do you see the ability of the Middle East to draw us back in, despite the pivot, rebalance, whatever you want to call it, efforts to really focus on China, and how? And I guess, how do you really make sense of that in the context of this particular national defense strategy?
Yeah, literally my whole career, including I was commissioned in the Navy in 1989 with some Chinese language background, and I was going to do a Western Pacific deployment, and I ended up being sent to Desert Shield, Desert Storm. So even as a young ensign, I experienced this. I was talking to our friend Ambassador Derek Mitchell last night, and we said it's a little bit like that Michael Corleone, you know, I think I'm out, and I always get drawn back in, I always get sucked back into the Middle East. So it does have a little bit of that quality to it. You know, I think maybe the difference is we've made this kind of pivot over several administrations now. I always said in the Trump administration, although the declaratory policy seemed to take a sharper turn, in fact, our policy, it was more evolutionary than revolutionary. You go back to the Obama pivot, 60% of naval forces were going to be in the Pacific, and the rebalance within the rebalance, more attention to Southeast Asia, et cetera. And then the Trump administration, with maybe a finer point on the language and declaratory policy, essentially continued movement in the same direction. And so the difference between now and maybe other Middle East conflicts where we were sort of drawn back in is sort of the great ship of state, with the help of Congress, is shifted in the direction of the Indo-Pacific. And so if you look at how we're resourcing our military and where the priorities are, slowly but surely it's come to the Indo-Pacific region, and the modernization of the joint force is really more focused for that great power competition and that challenge that China presents comprehensively. It doesn't mean that these aren't significant diversions, and it doesn't mean that these are wrong, or but I feel a little more confident that we're going to keep a focus on deterrence and support for allies and partners and posture initiatives in the Indo-Pacific than I might have been, say, 15, 20 years ago.
Okay. But another consistent feature, I guess, of this particular circumstance revolves around assurance of allies related to deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. And I'm sure that the conversations are already going on in Asian capitals. Well, how long is this going to last? What does it mean? They've got their energy concerns, but I'm sure that they're also concerned about the capacity of the United States to resource a conflict in Iran while also providing effective deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. What is the message that you deliver to allies or would want to deliver to allies at this moment?
Yeah, well, I mean, you're asking the right question, but one that none of us can really give a granular answer to, because we don't know how Iran's going to unfold and what kind of commitment that's ultimately going to be. We can point to what the administration is saying, but even there, this seems to be sort of creeping along to 4 or 5 weeks to now, however long it takes, to no boots on the ground, maybe boots on the ground. So I think our partners and allies are rightfully wondering what kind of diversion or commitment might this ultimately present, and what does that mean for the Indo-Pacific? That's your basic question. And look, I think a couple things I would point to. We are in many ways doubling down in the Indo-Pacific when it comes to alliance commitments, posture initiatives, the resourcing of the modernization of the joint force. When you look at extracting lessons from Ukraine and what that's going to mean for initiatives like Admiral Paparo's Hellscape. So I would say the resourcing is still there. I mean, they say the most precious resource in Washington is time and attention of the senior political leadership and elites, and clearly they're diverted. But the Defense Department is this amazing, massive enterprise that you get some momentum, and the inertia will just kind of carry you forward, including in very consequential, meaningful ways. So if you look at what Admiral Paparo is doing, I haven't seen any sort of interruption, or it might show up in the munitions and our ability to address the logistics gap in Indo-Pacific, but defense diplomacy, all the initiatives related to posture, all of that continues. And if you disaggregate and you look one by one of our treaty allies and close partnerships, I would say, yes, these questions hang over them, and yes, throw into that mix some discomfort over trade policy, tariffs, and the like. But as I look at each major engagement, President Trump and Prime Minister Takaichi, and we have an upcoming meeting there too, her numbers are great. They went up after President Trump met with her and visited her, and they had a trade framework, but also new commitments on the defense relationship, new initiatives that are non-traditional defense related to critical minerals, et cetera. If you look at the engagement with President Lee in South Korea, in the first term, those were very difficult engagements with Moon Jae-in, and President Trump's even public remarks were mostly about, we're not being paid enough to defend Korea. Why do we have all these troops on the Korean Peninsula? Ending exercises, and now, what are the headlines? Shipbuilding cooperation, and it's a much more kind of reciprocal narrative about how we need one another as allies, and same with Prime Minister Albanese with critical minerals and so on and so forth, President Marcos, and the extension of the ECTA agreement. So I share all the concerns about what this might ultimately mean. I think in the near term, I think we're in pretty good health when it comes to our alliances and partnerships.
Okay. With regard to this NDS, I think one of the clear emphasis is related to the first island chain, but also expanded defense burden sharing for Japan, Korea, et cetera. How do you feel that allies have responded to that? And are there any issues related to credibility of U.S. commitments that you see that were raised or that we're working through in that regard?
So clearly, if we look across the region and allies and partners, there is almost universally a commitment to raise the spending level and raise the investment level. And you could say that's pressure from the Trump administration staying on side, staying in good graces. You could give a lot of credit to China and North Korea and, by the way, Russia. So I think, the Trump administration's prioritization of burden sharing and really the shifting of that definition, it's not just what we get paid in host nation support, it's the expectation that countries are going to spend more and do more for themselves. But also responding to real threats and real changes to the security environment. I think we're seeing a general trend of spending more and spending wisely and smartly, fit for purpose. And I think that's going to actually strengthen the partnerships and the alliances, and it's going to ultimately persuade the Trump administration that these are more evenly spread burdens across alliances and therefore worthy of our continued interest and investment and involvement and improvement. because I think the reverse would be more troublesome. If countries were not on this trajectory, I think the inclination of the Trump administration would be to probably recede a little bit, step back. So, I think for allies in Asia, there's always sort of this fear of passing over or even worse, abandonment. In the worst case scenarios, when it comes to extended deterrence and the nuclear umbrella, there's always that issue of uncertainty. I mean, assurance when it comes to extended deterrence and strategic weapon systems is a pretty tricky thing. You can say, here's how it all works, here's how we sense and track and target and intercept and all that. But at the end of the day, they still have to believe you're going to sacrifice Los Angeles for Seoul or Tokyo. And that's you get that wrong once problem. You get that wrong once, and that's a big issue. So, there's always that element of fear of abandonment in the worst of times. And I think probably in the Trump administration, it's a little bit worse than traditionally, because there's this rhetoric of America first and all that. But I don't think it's entirely new or different either.
So you've kind of already teed up this question, but alongside the NDS and the NSS, presumably at some point there will be a nuclear posture review that should provide some clearer picture related to U.S. extended deterrence commitments. What would you expect from that document, and what do you think are the things that really need to be emphasized in the current context?
Yeah, and you got to throw into that the end of New START and sort of not only how the two parties to that agreement, the United States and Russia, interpret that and will proceed from that point of no longer being treaty bound to certain things, but how does China read that? How do other nuclear powers like India read that? What does this mean for Europe, that you have these discussions about U.S. reliability, and is France going to sort of be the country that extends nuclear umbrella to other European countries in the absence of confidence in the United States? So this is a really kind of dynamic time and really difficult to see precisely where it falls. But I would say I'm not getting from anybody in the administration that this is a point where we walk away from extended deterrence. In fact, a little bit, they sort of have some appreciation for what they might have unleashed with the end of New START, and they know the polls in Korea. They know how people are looking at the possibility of developing their own programs, their own weapon systems. And so I think for the moment being, for the foreseeable future in this administration, I think they're going to extend the period of extended deterrence and continue in the bilateral discussions and the working groups that are stood up, and there's been a lot of work on the Korea side in particular. I think that'll continue, and things could change if various capitals make decisions. If South Korea says, nope, we're gonna go do our thing, that obviously is an inflection point. But for the time being, I think we're status quo.
Okay. The last question I want to ask before we take a break and turn it over to the panel is, we have the National Defense Strategy, we have the National Security Strategy. You also are vice chair of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review.
I got promoted. I'm chair.
Oh, chair now.
I don't think anybody else wanted to do it, so I'm the.
Well, I think usually the vice chair position is the chair in waiting. But in any case, that's a very comprehensive and thorough report that was done alongside the drafting of these other documents, and we know that President Trump is planning to go to Beijing in early April. Mm-hmm. What are the recommendations from that report that you think bear particular emphasis at this moment in the context of a likely Trump-Xi meeting?
Yeah, so I guess I should point out the commission, our client is Congress. So we engage with the administration. Sometimes we want to know what their ideas are and what they want from Congress so that we can be used for a good cause. But at the end of the day, we're speaking to Congress, and we're trying to provide input into legislation, other congressional activities, And for us, legislation is sort of a year out. We aim for the NDAA of the following year. And so we're in a process now of talking to members and staff about some of our recommendations. And I think there's a lot in there that is either going to be impacted by the April meeting or adjacent to it. We have some recommendations about Taiwan and how to strengthen deterrence there. We have some recommendations that relate to economic statecraft, and of course there's spillover onto the security side when you look at the Chinese system of military-civil fusion and how they are kind of postured to leverage access to technology and what that might mean for military modernization. So we've got a lot to say about these things. We've said a lot over the years about these things. I think in Congress it's very well received. We now have a sister organization, the House Select Committee on China. We have probably more interest in our annual reports than ever because of events in the world and the growing challenges that China presents. And so I think our ability to kind of marshal specific ideas among Congress and the committees of relevance is really high. So I think we'll have this April meeting, and then Congress will react to it in some form. And it's an election year. The Republicans control both houses right now and have been really reluctant, I think, to challenge President Trump on most things. But that could change, and that could change at a time when our next report is landing and people are looking for ways to have Congress really kind of re-inject itself in some of this. So, I would just say watch this space.
Okay. Well, thank you, Randy, for taking some time to set the stage for our panel. I'm going to invite the panelists up to the stage. Please just give us a couple of minutes to do some stage adjustments, and then we'll be back with Jennifer Hong-Wetzel from IPS moderating the panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott.
Hello, my name is Jennifer Hong. I am with the Institute for Indo-Pacific Security. I'm a senior director, and I'm honored to be a moderator today for this event. At first, I just want to thank KEI for this partnership with IPS, and we hope that this will not be the last partnership event that we'll be doing. And this is also a very special day for me because I don't think I've been on a panel with these lovely experts all together, including my colleagues. So I just want to go down to my left. Ellen Kim, she is the Director of Academic Affairs at KEI. Yuki Tatsumi, Senior Director with IPS, and Mike Mazza, Senior Director at IPS. This panel will carry on from the conversation that Randy and Scott had earlier, and we're going to focus exclusively on Korea, Japan, and Taiwan's perspective of NDS today. So with that, I do want an opportunity to ask my panelists before we dive into specific questions that I had for you. Any thoughts that you want to, any impressions or thoughts that you had about the previous panel that, so we can carry into our next conversation. Go, Yuki.
Thank you, Jen. Just very quickly, I think the point that Randy made in his opening remarks about the continuity. I wonder if your microphone's on. Is it on? Oh, okay. All right. Oh, there you go. I think now it's on. I think I just didn't know how to work the microphone, so pardon me. I think it is important to know that continuity and evolution, not revolution, aspect of the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy that Randy pointed out, because it does often gets lost in the mix and the current events. And I think we all, in our different capacity, ends up spending a lot of time trying to explain to our, Japanese, Korean, Taiwanese counterpart, making them feel better that this is not a departure, and then we can get into the conversation about NDS. But I do recall spending a lot of time trying to explain to my Japanese counterpart, saying how homeland defense emphasis is really not new. Japan does the same. All the nation state does it. So don't freak out. So I think that continuity and evolution is really important, I think, for us to like all take home as we continue to watch the most recent, exciting is a bad word, very fluid situation.
I also echo what Yuki said, but I also want to point out that there are some new thinking emerging in South Korea about the NDS in general. I mean, after Trump administration took office, I think that there's evolutionary change in terms of how South Korea thinking about their role, and I think that there is a growing recognition within the South Korean policy community that the regional security environment has become really dangerous, and that the alliance must evolve to meet the new challenges. And also, South Korea it is in South Korea's interest to actually proactively modernize the alliance. So I think there is a lot of South Korean initiative that we have seen over the time that how the President Lee requests for a nuclear submarine, and then also other discussions about the 1-2-3 agreement. So I think there is a lot of much more opportunity that South Korea sees, despite the fact that there is also some concerns at the same time about the U.S. The NDS report.
And Jen, I'll just pick up on the end part of the conversation there about extended deterrence and the nuclear umbrella flag, some work that we have coming out later this spring, which is looking at the way that allies, and in this case particularly Australia, can take steps to help facilitate and ease the United States extension of the nuclear umbrella to allies and partners. So keep an eye out for that later this spring.
Thank you. Now I'm going to go down and ask questions, and then I would love an opportunity for you to just, if you have a comment to anything that your fellow panelists or speakers are saying, just let me know and I'll turn it over to you. So, Dr. Kim, let me start with you. The NDS, this NDS identifies South Korea as a capable ally to able to make primary responsibility for deterring North Korea. It cited strong military, high defense spending, robust defense industry, and so on. I just would love to know, kind of an open-ended, how is South Korea interacting with the NDS? What are some of their initial reactions? How are they responding to this?
So certainly there's a lot of questions and reservations about what it means for South Korea and what it means for U.S.-Korea alliance and then USFK. There are a lot of questions, for example, about whether South Korea is part of the first chain of island, or so what does it mean for U.S. nuclear extended deterrence, which is not mentioned in the NDS this time. So there are some concern, and some people even ask whether NDS is really important, or some. So there's a lot of questions, but I just want to point out the model ally language that being floating around in the space, and I think that there's at least two reactions that I've been observed, which is that on the one hand, there are people who feel relieved by the Trump administration's designation of South Korea as a model ally, especially given the growing earlier uncertainty about the direction and the future of the U.S.-Korea alliance and the USFK. As you know, at the beginning of the second Trump administration, there were strong calls for in Washington D.C. To the allies for increased defense spending, more burden sharing, and the alliance modernization. So I think that there was so against the backdrop, I think that the model ally designation was perceived, at least seen in the Seoul, as a positive signal that South Korea is meeting some certain expectation or demands by the Trump administration. On the other hand, there are other people who are much more cautious about the designation. Undersecretary Defense for Policy Elbridge Colby described South Korea as a model ally for two grounds. One, it's South Korea's commitment to increase defense spending to 3.5% of GDP, and also South Korea's willingness to take a greater responsibility for its national defense. But if you read the NDS report closely, it is the Israel that was mentioned as a model ally, and for its willingness and ability to defend itself with the limited but critical U.S. support. So I think that there are some cautious voice in South Korea that cautioning that this model ally designation may come with a higher expectation and added responsibility.
Not to create any trouble in the Korea-Japan relationship here, do you think, Yuki, I'm gonna turn it over to you too for a thought on that. Any play that naming only one of US allies, Japan or Korea, to be a model ally in the NDS, would that have caused problems, issues for either of the country? This is purely your opinion.
I don't think so, and then I really don't. I have not heard any of my Japanese colleagues reacting to are okay. Is the between the two? Yeah.
What would have happened in Korea if Japan was called a model ally, but not Korea?
Yes, there's a rivalry always between South Korea and Japan about whether you are considered as a model ally or even like the pillar. What was the exact word under the Obama administration? There was a certain word. There were Japan and South Korea were sort of like fighting over this. But I think that at this point, I think South Korea and Japan are pretty much in the same situation about the direction the U.S. is going. So I don't think that South Korea is in a position to necessarily have a rivalry over this language right now.
This is great. Let's talk a little bit more about North Korea. So the NDS acknowledges that DPRK's conventional inferiority, but flags its own growing missile and nuclear threat, including to the U.S. homeland. Yet very sparse on lines of effort for engagement of denuclearization. What kind of sign or signal do you think that's sending to Kim Jong-un, who is also reading this NDS, presumably, and he just came out of his National Congress. What do you think North Korea and Pyongyang is thinking about this?
So my view is that I'm not so sure whether the absence of North Korea denuclearization in the NDS report itself is deliberately intended to send a signal to Pyongyang. The Trump administration may be still in the process of developing a nuclear policy, or there could be other bureaucratic reasons or other considerations at play. So until as Scott and Randy talk about the nuclear posture review, I think until that report comes out, we can only speculate why this was missed in the NDS report. That said, I think that omission itself has created impression or perception that the Trump administration may be trying to leave the door open for dialogue, especially given that President Trump repeated interest in meeting Kim Jong-un since he returning to office last year. And some even argue that Kim Jong-un may have responded. Kim Jong-un response during the 9th Party Congress last week was a response to what he perceived as a U.S. olive branch. So he said that if the U.S. withdraw its policy of confrontation with North Korea by respecting our country's current status, there's no reason why we cannot get along well with the United States. But with the current situation we are in with Iran over the last 3 days, I think that the prospect for Kim-Trump Summit 2.0 is, I think, really low, although we cannot entirely preclude, rule out that possibility entirely. So we have to see how this goes.
May I turn to my other speakers? What's your sense on the possibility of a Trump-Kim having even a sideline meeting, maybe in the, around Trump-Xi meeting in April?
I know President Trump wants it, but I think I agree with Ellen. I think the probability is very low. I don't, because these things, it takes two to tango, as you say, and then President Trump may want it, but then I don't think Kim Jong-un needs it at this juncture.
Mike? Nothing to add to that. All right. Well, Yuki, you have your mic, so I'm going to go over to you. So in this NDS, Japan's broader role is implied through the Indo-Pacific framing. In the language, allies and partners' contributions will be vital to deterring and balancing China, with emphasis on strengthening collective defense along the first island chain. You briefly alluded to some of Japan's reaction, but I just would love to hear. You've been in Japan, I think, definitely once, maybe twice since NSS and NDS, and so would love to hear from you. What are you hearing on the ground from your contacts and friends?
So, first of all, thank you, KEI, for giving us, all of us, the opportunity. And it takes an event like this to see my colleagues at the same time. So this is awesome. So, in the response to your question, Jen, great question. I would say I think both national security strategy and defense strategy, in the eyes of the Japanese, especially for those in the Japanese defense enterprise, is really being really looked at as a reinforcement of what Tokyo already had set in motion for its own defense. I would go back to 2022, Japan's national security strategy and defense strategy, where it already did identify that Japan's regional security environment is already getting worse. And this, we need to be mindful that this was written as the Ukraine-Russia war was unfolding. And then also this Prime Minister Kishida's commitment about fundamentally enhancing Japan's defense capability, that really kind of precedes any of this regional place in terms of Japan, the growing awareness that Japan really needs to bring more to the table for its own defense. And by doing more in its own defense, it actually does contribute as a whole to the alliance structure. And U.S.-Japan alliance-wise, there already has been some movement toward greater coordination and deeper level operational cooperation, such as Japan's standing up on the Japan's Joint Operation Command. And then also U.S. Force Japan, although detail, I think we're still learning this as we go, U.S. Forces Japan is also going to be augmented in its authority and its capability. So these kind of efforts already precedes our national security strategy and defense strategy. So this is definitely a reinforcement for people in Tokyo who have been working on this, that their effort is moving, their effort is in the right direction. And then I think that Prime Minister Takaichi being in place only accelerates this ongoing efforts, and she already announced that Japan will speed up the modernization and revision of this their critical national security document. So basically modernizing Japan's own national security strategy and defense strategy, as well as acquisition program, defense build-up plan by the end of this year. This is kind of a year earlier than what it had been on schedule in the past. And also mentioning of the First Island chain also reinforces Japan's own recognition that its own security partnership with the regional partners like Korea, Australia, Philippines, and then also Taiwan is increasingly important. And then I think Japan over the years has made a lot of investment in institutionalizing U.S.-Japan-Australia trilateral, but then with renewed closer personal relationship, a much more positive relationship between Prime Minister Takaichi and President Ii, I think U.S.-Japan ROK is very much on track. And then I think we will see a lot of movements happening on that front, because I think finally Tokyo and Seoul's perception of the security challenges, not just from North Korea, but also from PRC, is finally converging. So I would say the same thing for the U.S.-Japan-Philippines. So I think I would expect Tokyo to be much more robust in terms of its defense diplomacy. And I do know that Tokyo definitely appreciates that. Of course, President's statement has been relatively unpredictable, to put it mildly. But on the other end of the spectrum is Secretary Rubio and Secretary Hegseth has been a very good steward of these alliance relationships. They're appearing at these defense forums in Shangri-La and all these multilateral frameworks that both, I think, Japan and Korea cares a lot. And that really is received very well from, at least from my Japanese counterpart.
Yuki, PM Prime Minister Takaichi is supposed to be in Washington, D.C., either March 16th or March 19th. 19th. What could we expect as we, what are your assessment on the conversations that they would be having leading up to Trump-Xi visit?
So first of all, I think this is the first visit that the Prime Minister Takaichi faces President Trump in her own right. Their first meeting in October in Tokyo, it was very positive, but then she was kind of in the mode of serving out her predecessor's term. But now she comes here with a renewed mandate that she won, and we all know that President Trump likes a winner. She won big. So that already puts a very positive tone of to overlay of the to the summit. But I think on the publicly announced side of the game would be more on what Japan can concretely bring to the table in terms of the investment deal. I think she is mobilizing every part of Japanese government to bring something concrete that they can both sign with, very public ceremony. But on a quiet level, she would likely reinforces her, Japan's concerns about where Beijing is heading, its recent posture, its growing aggressiveness, and I don't really think she would turn to President Trump to say anything publicly to jeopardize his upcoming summit in Beijing, but it would make her very happy if President Trump just simply restates the standing policy on issues that are Japan's concern. For example, Senkaku Islands issue and things that just simply reiterating the standing U.S. policy on that, I think will be positive for her.
Thank you. Mike, it's time for you. All right.
I'm ready.
Okay. The 2025 National Security Strategy prioritized the defense of Taiwan in a way that surprised many observers. And then you said deterring a conflict over Taiwan, ideally by preserving military overmatch is a priority. And then within 2 months later, the NDS came out and Taiwan went entirely unmentioned. What do you think, how do you think Taiwan is looking at this and interpreting the administration's potential posture, priority, and its commitment to Taiwan?
Yeah, so I think there's a good news story and a bad news story when it comes to Taiwan. I think we need to look certainly at these two documents, but at administration actions as well. So let's start with the good news story. One, yes, the National Security Strategy explicitly described deterring a conflict over Taiwan as a priority. Its prescription for doing so, as you said, was military overmatch. That's not a word that DoD has an acceptable definition for, but it's usually used in a way that's meant to indicate military superiority, the ability to decisively defeat your enemy. And that's very reassuring for Taiwan, as well as for other U.S. allies and partners in the region. You're right that disappears from the NDS. Not just a mention of Taiwan, but any mention of overmatch is gone from the NDS as well. The second positive story here is one of arms sales. So we've had two so far that were notified to Congress. The first, coming last mid-autumn, was relatively small, spare parts and services for the Air Force, I believe. The second package announced in December was large, over $11 billion. Looking at HIMARS, self-propelled howitzers, anti-armor UAV systems, Javelin missile systems, others, things that are very important for Taiwan's defense strategy and the defense strategy that the United States has been encouraging Taiwan to adopt for a long time. There's now talk of a third arms sale. FT initially reported that was going to be valued at $20 billion. The latest reporting out of New York Times is $13 billion. This is said to include Patriot missiles, NASAMS, which are other surface-to-air missiles, other air and missile defense systems, and integration software. According to the Times, however, this is being put on hold pending the meeting with Xi Jinping. That's not great, but it's also not unusual in the course of U.S.-China diplomacy. So, if it turns out that this notification is delayed by a couple of months, no big deal. If it turns out it's something larger than that, if it turns out that arms sales to Taiwan are on the table, and President Trump at one point said in the last month that he would discuss them with President Xi, which is contrary to U.S. past policy, that would be a big deal. So we kind of have to wait and see. The third good news story is that as far as is publicly known, U.S. military training in Taiwan is continuing. This has been maturing since the first administration. It's good to see that the president and this administration are sticking to an enhanced training program for Taiwanese military in Taiwan. And fourth, and finally, just last month, the United States and Taiwan concluded a economic agreement. Right, so this has been a long-running problem in U.S.-Taiwan relations. Before he was inaugurated the second time around, President Trump said that Taiwan had stolen the U.S. chip industry. About a year ago, he imposed tariffs on Taiwan along with most of the rest of the world. It has taken a while for this to get resolved, but this new agreement reduces tariffs on a bilateral basis. And so it's good to have that behind us. There is a bad news story as well. So I've pointed a couple of those things. Again, no mention of Taiwan in the NDS, no mention of overmatch. The NDS does embrace the national security strategy's intention to sustain a denial defense along the first island chain. The first island chain includes Taiwan, but the omission of that precise language here, it's an interesting choice, and it's hard to know what, if anything, to make of it. It's also worth looking at the speech that Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Elbridge Colby gave in Korea, his first public remarks after the release of the NDS, for which he was responsible for. In his speech, he said that the U.S. Or the Trump administration seeks a favorable balance of power in which no state can impose its hegemony. And if we do a close reading, which I think is fair, this would actually be a somewhat radical shift from long-term U.S. practice, right? So the United States has long sought to ensure that there would be no hostile hegemon on the Asian mainland or in the Asian littorals that could threaten the United States, as Japan did in World War II. But it's also established its own distant, what I would describe as a benign hegemony in the region. This has been welcomed, I would argue, by most Asian states because it's stabilizing. And if we are moving into a world in which the Trump administration doesn't think we should or can maintain our own preeminent position, I think that leads to a less stable Indo-Pacific. And the last thing I'll say on the sort of the bad news story is the National Defense Strategy has this emphasis, and it's a repeated emphasis on finding what it calls a decent peace with China. That word decent is doing a lot of work. It's unclear what exactly that means. My reading of the NDS is that it seems to me to suggest that there is a sort of a happy modus vivendi that China and the United States can find. I don't think that that's the case. I think Chinese and American interests are fundamentally opposed in important ways, including with respect to Taiwan. And if a decent peace is truly a priority for the Trump administration, I think that could bode ill for our relationship with Taiwan. All that being said, I think we are sort of in the good news world right now. Actions matter a lot. And again, those arms sales, the ongoing training, settling trade disputes, these are positive things. So I think Taiwan should take solace in that, but be wary of where things could head.
Thank you. I may turn to you at some point, to both of you, to talk about just maybe how Japan and Korea are interacting with the term phrase decent peace. So before coming to that, Mike, you talked about things are looking good. As as best as we can interpret that. I do want to talk about what's happening in Taiwan right now. There is a special budget proposed by President Lai, and I know there are two additional versions that are on the legislative yuan floor that needs to be reviewed. With the current state of political disagreements about national defense spending, how do you think that might be being perceived in Washington, D.C. about Taiwan's commitment to its own self-defense?
Yeah. So I'm a little bit more optimistic about the special budget than I was a couple of weeks ago. I think this compromise to have debate on all three versions is opens a pathway to getting the President Lai's version through. I could be wrong about that. The TPP just said yesterday that they'll agree to the defense budget if the United States notifies new arms sales first before the Trump-Xi meeting. So the opposition is continuing to play some games here, but I do think we are potentially on a path to getting this done. But I do fear that this is having, or threatens to have, a negative impact on U.S.-Taiwan relations going forward. I think it's going to leave a bad taste in the mouths of people in both countries. Let's accept the argument that the TPP and KMT make that they have legitimate concerns with the makeup and the size of the defense budget. That's all fine. But I think it also looks to observers here and in Congress in particular, probably in the administration, that the KMT and the TPP, even if their concerns about what's in this budget are legitimate, are not approaching this question of Taiwan's defense with sufficient urgency. And we've had a couple of instances of this, which I will just read because I found them quite shocking in the language used. So Senator Dan Sullivan, in a tweet about a month ago, after another failure of moving this budget through the process, noted that, meantime, the leadership of the opposition party responsible for this, the KMT, is in Beijing, meeting with the CPP and planning bigger engagements. It doesn't take a genius to figure out what's going on here. I've warned before, shortchanging Taiwan's defense to kowtow to the CCP is playing with fire. Pretty strong words from a U.S. Senator weighing into domestic political debates in Taiwan. Also around that same time, Senators Risch and Shaheen issued a joint statement in which they said, let's see, instead of pursuing photo opportunities with the Chinese Communist Party, leaders in Taiwan must focus on approving funding for critical military reforms and improvements in whole of society resilience, et cetera, et cetera. So again, really strong words from members of Congress on the actions that the KMT in particular is taking. The DPP is not going to be in power forever in Taiwan. And again, even if the special budget gets through, I worry about our ability, America's ability, to work with a future KMT or even TPP administration, given the way that this has all played out over the last couple of months.
Yeah. Thoughts on decent peace?
It can be read in a number of ways, like Mike was saying. But I think Japan also, for the longest time, I think Japanese defense enterprise actually pays more attention to what the administration actually does in action as opposed to these terminologies. And then I think from Tokyo's vantage point, whatever's going on coming out of Washington consistently from the Pentagon is encouraging, even on extended deterrence. Like Korea, Japan has a long extended deterrence dialogue with Washington amongst the policymakers, and there were cadres of defense officials and foreign ministry officials who actually has a deeper appreciation and understanding of what it means when some things are said. So I think it does have a very quiet reassurance effects, but let's not forget, I think Japan really doesn't have a plan B when it comes to alliance relationship. Alliance relationship with Washington is the only option that Japan has. But Tokyo does try to safeguard this relationship by enhancing its own relationship with other U.S. allies, like Korea. I would now put it at the top, but then more in Australia. Their Prime Minister of Canada is supposed to be in Tokyo over the weekend, and which is kind of which is an interesting development. And then also this goes back to Prime Minister Takaichi's predecessor, Prime Minister Ishiba, at the height of the diplomatic tension between U.S. and India, primarily because of the trade issues. Prime Minister Modi actually did make a stopover before he goes to Beijing and do all those, fancy meetings and very public meetings. So Japan is definitely holding steady in terms of strengthening its relationship with other regional partners. And I think, to me, that seemed to be the effort, like a sustaining effort, of making sure whatever the word "the decent peace" means will not be at the expense of Japan's core security interests.
I mean, it depends on how we interpret the different piece, as Yuki mentioned. But if I remember how NDS report talk about this, I think that it says that to deter China in the Indo-Pacific through strength, not confrontation. And I think the NDS also indicated that U.S. interest is basically it opposes one single country actually dominating the region. So if that is how the U.S. definition of decent peace is, then I think the South Korea government, given its policy of pragmatic, national interest-based foreign policy, and its desire to maintain a stable relation with China, I think that decent peace is acceptable to South Korea right now.
Thank you. I have one more question for all of you. I do want to give an opportunity for you to start thinking about your questions. Those folks who are tuning in from online on YouTube Live, please submit your questions. And as they become available, we will also try to entertain them as much as we can. We have a rule at IPS. You must have your name and affiliation for your question to be prioritized. So if you are submitting questions online, please do that as well. So, OPCON transfer. I'm going to talk to you about that. That is definitely at the forefront of Seoul and Washington's posture towards deterrence for the region. How important is this for U.S. ROC alliance under the Trump administration and the priorities outlined? That's for you, Ellen. And then for Yuki, how is OPCON transfer being perceived in Japan? And then for you, Mike, how does this impact Taiwan's calculation about its own defense when countering Chinese aggressions in the region, or in the Strait and for the region? Who wants to go first? You go first. Go ahead.
So the outcome transition, this issue is a very important issue for both South Korea and the U.S., but for different reasons. For South Korea, especially under a progressive government, the outcome transition has been always viewed as a matter of national sovereignty. And also President Lee, this is one of President Lee's campaign pledges. And after he took office, he made it clear that he wanted the OPCON transfer to be one of the key defense policy objectives during his tenure. So in the U.S., I think the Trump administration seems quite supportive of the Lee government's push for the OPCON transfer because it aligns with the U.S. interest, and then Trump administration called for allies to take a greater responsibility for national defense. It also fits well with the U.S. interests and efforts to adjust the U.S. force posture on the Korean Peninsula, and I think that so that the U.S. actually can focus on other more regional priority by ensuring the greater flexibility of USFK. I guess the point is that both U.S. and South Korea, I think, aligned in principle on the direction of the OPCON transfer, which could help accelerate the bilateral discussion on the issue. But there are certainly both sides also need to approach this issue very carefully. South Korea needs to make a condition, 3 condition. This is a 3-stage verification process, and I think that South Korea is now in the 2nd stage. And I think that there's a lot of discussion about with the exercises being reduced recently. I think that could also affect how U.S. assess the South Korea's meeting 2nd verification process. But the point is that this is a very delicate issue, and I think both countries have to approach this very carefully.
Can I quickly ask, how is that being received in Korean? Korean public is all for this transfer, for the national sovereignty argument?
I don't have a chance to see the polling on this issue, but I think this is still under the surface. And once it becomes coming above the surface, I think this could be quite, there could be a lot of discussions and debates within South Korea.
So I think opcon transfer, from a Japanese perspective, this is a long process, right? Like kind of long drawn out process. Sometimes it makes a progress and it gets paused for a little bit for different reasons because of the sensitivities that this issue has in Korean context of Korean domestic politics. But I think for a larger issue for Japan is implication of opcon transfer that has on U.S. Force Korea's role in the region. Because if this means that U.S. forces in Korea become so regional, and strategic flexibility is often what's being talked about, how does that relate to the ongoing effort of upgrading USFJ? There are both 4-star positions in terms of the commander, and how does each of these country-specific U.S. Force Command is relating to Indo-PACOM, also their own in-country counterpart, and what does that mean for trilateral collaboration and coordination? I think it has a broader implication for how Japan's own Joint Operation Command is going to relate with USFJ. Is USFK relationship is going to become important and come into play? And how does that work with they still have the relationship with Indo-PACOM as well. So I think this figuring out all the command relationship is going to be a very big challenge for Japan.
I'd say my sense is Taiwan is not watching this closely. I would foot stomp everything that Yuki just said. And what I mean by that is anything that's good for Japan here, I think, is good for Taiwan. I think it depends on what happens in a post-OPCON world. So if the Trump administration sort of takes this opportunity to, looks at the Korean Peninsula and sort of confidently assesses that the Koreans have it, can we focus more of our efforts and attention elsewhere? That's positive. Taiwan will benefit from that. If it says, the rocks have it, we can step back, then that's concerning for everybody. I would have been more concerned about that in the Trump 1. I'm less concerned about that, in Trump 2, given everything that we've discussed and we heard from Randy earlier. There is another line in the National Defense Strategy we didn't talk about, which is potentially enlightening here and potentially concerning. Again, it depends on how you read it. And that line is this. So it's in the context of talking about the importance of maintaining a denial defense along the first island chain. The NDS then says this: at the same time, in the process of erecting a strong denial defense along the first island chain, the Department of War will ensure that the Joint Force always has the ability to conduct devastating strikes and operations against targets anywhere in the world, including directly from the U.S. homeland, thereby providing the President with second-to-none operational flexibility and agility. And I think there's a real question about what this means. There's sort of more generous and less generous readings. A less generous reading would be that this is sort of putting a stake in the ground for the potential of shifting to an offshore balancing approach to the region. I don't think that's what it is, but it is how I first read it. A second option is that this is a reference to U.S. Special Forces, Special Operations. A friend of mine makes this point, given Chairman Dan Kane's background. in which case that doesn't have much of a bearing here. Third option, and it could be all three of these, third option is that is a reference to the nuclear capabilities. And discussing it in this context perhaps again suggests again putting a stake in the ground for the option of stepping away from or reducing our reliance on conventional options and reasserting the importance of nuclear options in maintaining peace and stability in Asia. I think that's probably not a good thing, but again, it's worth watching.
Thank you. I want to turn it over to our audience. If we have any questions. Wow, so many hands. So this is what we're going to do. You're going to state your name, your affiliation, questions, not comments, is what I will say. So do we have a microphone that will go around? Okay, let's. In the ceiling. That's perfect. So this is 1, 2, 3, 3, 4, 5. So please quickly. Go ahead.
Thanks. Mark Fitzpatrick. I'm with the International Institute for Strategic Studies. More importantly, I'm on the board of directors of KEI. I wonder how much predictive power NDS has regarding U.S. policy toward North Korea. Ellen, you've already talked about this, but do you think that in light of recent events, if President Trump thought that he could take out all of North Korea's launchers before they could put a nuclear weapon in the air, wouldn't he do it? I mean, he's taken out Venezuela, he's taken out Iran, Cuba is being squeezed to death. Who's next? Kim Jong-un must be getting pretty worried about this. Big difference is that in Asia, America's allies have always said, don't attack, we're gonna suffer, unlike the Middle East where Israel and Saudi Arabia said attack, attack. Will Prime Minister Takaichi maybe vary from that when she talks to Trump? Will she kind of encourage him at all, or will he maybe misinterpret what she says and maybe think that Japan would like to see Kim Jong-un removed?
I need to think about this one.
Venezuela's leader Maduro was captured, and what happened to Iran's leader a few days ago, everybody thought about, wow, Kim Jong-un would be really terrified by now. But I've been thinking about this quite a lot, but I think that Iran and North Korea are quite different. First, North Korea does have nuclear weapons. So it's much more risky for the U.S. to actually take that military option. Also, there's China and Russia behind the North Korea's backing. So I think it's also geostrategically it's very risky operation to do that. Also, South Korea and Japan, right there directly under the nose of North Korea's nuclear and military threats. So when President Clinton was thinking about strategic strike against the North Korea facility in 1994, President Kim Jong-sam opposed to that idea and also there is an assessment within the U.S. military that it could result in hundred millions of people, Korean people, dying out of that. So, I mean, same situation here. So I think it's going to be much more difficult for U.S. from President Trump to think about that option for North Korea. Yeah.
So for Prime Minister Takaichi, for Japan, not just Prime Minister Takaichi per se, but then I think for Japan, something catastrophic like that in North Korea means massive confusion on the Korean Peninsula, meaning potential outflow of refugees or other types. And then let's not forget there are a lot of Japanese living and working and studying in Seoul and Republic of Korea. So all that is a catastrophic situation for Japan that it really wants to avoid. Definitely wants to make sure that Japan will never give up the denuclearization of North Korea as its as its policy goal. But would they want North Korean current regime to go down, risking that catastrophic effect, which will impact Japanese economy deeply? And as I forgot to mention this, but even though Prime Minister Takaichi won big and very popular, there's a reason behind her big election win, which means the Japanese public really wants her to deliver on the economy, in the domestic economy. All that comes at the perilous state if something catastrophic happens in North Korea. And then I think I'm sure she's already worried about the oil prices, and that would impact has on her economic agenda. So I really don't think Prime Minister Takaichi would say anything that President Trump will potentially take it as encouraging him to take him out.
I'm going to take the second question and then a question from online. So go ahead.
I'm Ta-Hong Chen. I'm a visiting fellow from CSIS. So there's an old saying like nothing unites people more than a common adversary. So given the geopolitical situation in Indo-Pacific area, how optimistic are you with regard to how Japan and ROK government will be able to drop some of the historical and political baggage and move forward to work together and commit resource and assets jointly on some of the issues such as protecting subsea cables, safeguard sea line of communication, or counter CCP gray zone activities? And how do you feel that they will be able to gain public support on those issues? Thank you.
So we have two virtual questions from Terrence Matsuo, a non-resident fellow here at KEI. For Ms. Tatsumi, with the Trump administration's recent decisions in Venezuela and Iran, how could this impact Japan's defense modernization, particularly Prime Minister Takaichi's intelligence reforms? For Dr. Kim, there are conflicting reports online in English about the status of the THAAD system in Korea. If they are moved, how could it impact the U.S.-Korea alliance and relationships with North Korea?
So I promised Ellen that I'd take this tricky question first because she did it. She picked it up from the team, the last one. So my read on current state of Japan-ROK relationship, I think, is that there's a conservative prime minister who so far has chose not to do anything provocative to trigger Korean domestic sensitivities on a history issue. And you have progressive presidents in Seoul who actually is reaching out also to Japan to get the bilateral relations on track. And I think that goes back to what you just said before you said anything. Basically, nothing unites people more than shared enemies. And then I think both Tokyo and Seoul has. I think I have Beijing to thank because it just like gifts keep on giving. So I think that I mentioned this a little earlier that convergence of threat perception in Tokyo and Seoul about the challenges that it faces. And some of the threat, Seoul feel it more acutely because you're connected by land. So I think that is really working at play. I really think that the best place we can be in terms of the bilateral relationship is where Seoul and Tokyo and Seoul can basically compartmentalize the sensitive issues and put a greater focus from the leadership level more on the practical issues like security cooperation. How does Japan and Korea work together on the critical minerals and other economic security related initiatives like the undersea cables? So I think we are off to a good start watching this two leaders' relationship so far. So that's, I hope that answers your question. To Terrence's question, good question. LDP and Japan Innovation Party is about to come up with has just come up with their their own party version of a recommendation for intelligence reform. This is a very tricky thing. Prime Minister Takaichi does have it as a priority. It probably does affect her mindset on what this integrated interagency intelligence organization should look like, whether that needs to be more, that needs to look more like more counterterrorism intelligence, if you will, the base, or like law enforcement-led effort, or more defense enterprise-led effort, because those two can mean a very different outcome for the future of this new intelligence organization that she is trying to form. And I think juries is still out.
Given the time constraints, I won't say much to the Korea-Japan relations. I'll go straight to the other question about the deployment of THAAD to the Middle East. Thanks for letting me know about that news, because I didn't know. But I think that basically this, again, I think underscores how U.S. might perceive this as the importance of the greater flexibility of the U.S. FK and its resources. This is not the first time that actually South Korea, U.S. assets on South Korean Peninsula were deployed to Iran. Actually, when U.S. hit Iran last year, I think it was THAAD or Patriot that got also deployed to that region. So as long as I think there is this does not compromise the joint dual deterrence posture of the U.S. and South Korea, I think, and based on their close communication and consultation, I think that this shouldn't be creating constraints on the alliance.
I know we have so many more questions from the audience due to time. Actually, maybe we have one more. One more. Okay, let's do one more. I know there was number 3 here. Actually, let's skip to number 4. I think you were number 4. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Tom Ramich, and I'm with Great Economic Institute. My question is actually a bit about the previous pivot to Asia that we had under the Obama administration. Now with regime change in Venezuela and potentially Iran, what do you think is next after this? Some people think that this is preparing the United States to completely focus on China. What happens after Iran and Venezuela? Are we going to be solely focused on China?
I'm gonna start with you, Mike.
Yeah, I don't know. The first thing I'll say is a lot depends on how this Iran operation turns out, right? I mean, as Randy talked about earlier, it's unclear whether this is intended to be weeks or months or something longer. And even if it's only intended to be a month-long operation, you know, the enemy gets a vote, and we just don't know what happens next year. You know, setting that aside, my own personal view is the ongoing nearly 2-decade attempt to pivot now. Actually, you know, the first Bush administration attempted to pivot as well, using different language. I think one of the things it teaches us is that we can't necessarily prioritize in that way. Every time we have tried to pivot away from either the Middle East or Europe, we've seen instability result. And so, to my mind, this is an argument for primacy across all 3 theaters. That's an expensive undertaking. It requires political will, which I think is lacking at this point. But that's the lesson that I draw. I don't know that it's the lesson anybody else draws.
Yeah, I really agree with Nick. I don't know what would be my answer to, but I think Mike is absolutely right. I think we can't really think of this different geographic theater in like a zero-sum way. He talked about, Mike, you talked about the Bush administration tried to do the first pivot. I actually would like to highlight that President Clinton, in his very first term, first speech that he delivered in Japan, he talked about Pacific Century. So you can also argue that, U.S. since the end of the Cold War recognized the potential strategic significance of the Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific region, and has been trying since then to make it a priority. And every time they tried, something else happens at the other part of the world. And this is like an ongoing endeavor. But what I would highlight, though, is that throughout all the administrations, Republicans or Democrat, this is where I go back to Randy. The U.S. policy toward this region is more about evolution. It's really not a revolutionary, knee-jerk, snap back and look back again. It's really steady attention from 1993, if I count right. So I agree with Mike. I don't know what happens. It really depends on how this Iran situation unfolds. But like Randy said, even when this Iran situation gets much more protracted than any of us anticipates at this point, Train has left the Indo-Pacific in terms of a lot of the initiatives. And I don't see that anyone tries to actively intervene and stop that train.
This is just my personal view, but if we just look at what's going to happen after Iran, the result is that after Venezuela, Iran, what happens to China is that it's basically squeezing the oil supply to China. 80% of the oil coming from the Middle East. So look at the heading into the summit in April, actually at the end of March, President Trump has leverage. So maybe, I don't think it is attacking Iran, it was intended to sabotage his coming summit with the President Xi, but still I think that there's something we could actually think about how all this kind of affect the U.S. strategic position vis-a-vis China in the upcoming summit.
Well, thank you for your insightful thoughts and comments. Thank you for your questions. Our speakers will stick around if you have unanswered questions. I just volunteered you all, so hopefully you will come and ask some additional questions. I just want to thank KEI again for this partnership. We have KEI and IIPS. We both have very active social media and website for our next events and publications, so please continue to follow our work. Thank you.